DOE CSGF Fellow Janelle Feather in the field of neuroscience at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology.
As humans navigate the world, we can easily parse stimuli from the world around us. For instance, you can easily hear the pressure wave of a friend's voice as they're speaking to you. And when you see a photo of your friend's new pet, you immediately know that they got a dog and not a cat. Our sensory systems, such as the visual system and the auditory system, provide the inputs for how we navigate the world. And understanding how these systems work has often been a focus in neuroscience. In recent years, artificial neural networks have emerged as the leading models of sensory systems. To understand how the field arrived at the artificial networks we have today, let's take a quick look at the history of how machine learning and neuroscience have inspired each other. So by 1942, work in neuroscience had identified that a biological neuron receives spiking inputs from neighboring neurons. It accumulates the activity and then decides to spike dependent on the strength of its inputs. This inspired the first artificial neuron proposed by McCullough and Pitts in 1942. But a major advance came in 1958 with the development of Rosenblatt's perceptron. This allowed for the connection weights to first be randomly initialized, and then these weights were updated as the network was trained to do a binary task. For instance, saying if an object was on the left-hand or right-hand side of the screen. Now, this perceptron was seen as a major advance, and the field believed that expanding the perceptron to more complicated tasks was soon to come. As somebody who's primarily interested in studying how humans hear, I really like this quote from a New York Times article announcing the discovery. So within this article, Rosenblatt said, "Only one more step of development, a difficult step, is needed for the device to hear speech in one language and instantly translate it to speech or writing in another language." So this is really quite optimistic for the 1950s, but it's kind of cool because now 60 years later, we finally are at a point where we can actually develop these universal translation algorithms. So what exactly happened within the interleaving 60 years? So scaling these networks to more complicated tasks is actually really difficult because by design, the perceptron could only work on tasks where one could draw a linear decision rule. But building on the idea that there are multiple different neurons which are stacked in the brain, multi-layer perceptrons consisting of stacks of multiple perceptron units created what were called deep neural networks. Additionally, during this time, the idea of backpropagation, which is essentially the chain rule from calculus, was developed as a way to train these networks and update the weights from something random to something useful as the network sees the training data. However, these networks were actually still very hard to train and they were computationally expensive. And this, along with many other things, led to the so-called AI winter. But computing resources expanded and some people came up with some clever tricks to help train deeper and larger networks. So in 2011, the deep convolutional network AlexNet demonstrated that networks could reach close to human performance on image classification tasks. Shown here is an example schematic of a deep convolutional network, which is the primary model class I will be talking about today. Each sheet of this network is a result of a convolution with a particular filter, or it's the output of a pooling or normalization operation. And sets of sheets represent all of the activations in the particular layer. In this case, it would be all of the outputs from the different convolutional units. And within this model class, it finally seemed possible to train deep neural networks effectively for difficult tasks. And there was an explosion in deep learning models. These networks are often trained to perform tasks such as speech recognition and object classification. And when properly optimized, they can do about as well as humans. Now, in the study of vision and hearing, we have long attempted to build models of what is happening in the human sensory systems. And these developments have been exciting because finally we can have models that perform tasks that are interesting perceptually. And because of this, there's widespread interest in deep convolutional neural networks for them to be taken seriously as models of the brain. So one critical part of the representational power of these networks is their invariance. And that is what I will be primarily discussing today. So what is invariance? For instance, a speech recognition network can successfully work on many different voices. It's essentially invariant to the speaker. Or an object classification network can recognize a dog from many different viewing angles. It becomes invariant to the pose or the location of the dog. Now, this is not an easy task. The pixel values present in each of these dog images are very, very different. And yet humans and now neural networks are able to recognize all of the images as a dog. Because this is exactly what the network is trained to do, many researchers think that the invariances learned by these networks may in fact be similar to those used by the human perceptual systems. So in this work, we're going to ask that question directly. We investigated whether the invariances that are learned by deep neural networks actually match up with human perceptual invariances. And the way that we went about this is by using the idea of metamers. Metamers are two stimuli that are physically different, but that produce the same responses within a system. The word metamer was first used in the study of color perception. It's possible to come up with two light sources with different spectral power distributions, such that when they are projected onto the responses of photoreceptors in the human eye, the light sources are perceived as the same color. This provided the first evidence for three types of cones in the human eye, long before we could explicitly measure their physiological properties. In fact, this is the basis for all image reproduction technologies, like your computer screen. The spectral power on the left is the natural spectral power of the sun, while on the right, it is a spectrum produced by a CRT monitor, but that it's perceived as the same color to humans. And so, motivated by previous work using metamers, the main idea behind our work is that a good model of human perception will share invariances and thus will share metamers with humans. To address this, we generate stimuli that are indistinguishable to a deep neural network, and we call these stimuli model metamers because these stimuli are metameric for our model. As I mentioned, I primarily study the auditory system, so many of the models I'll discuss today are based on sound. For instance, this convolutional network that's trained to do a speech recognition task. To get a model metamer, we take a natural sound, feed it into the model, and measure the set of model activations at a particular network stage. We then take a noise stimulus, feed it into the model, and measure the set of activations at the same network stage, for instance, this intermediate convolutional layer. Now, at first, these activations do not match up. The activations for the original sound and for the noise are very different because there's two different sounds. So how do we generate our model metamer? Well, we set up an L2 loss between that sets of activations and propagate gradients the entire way back to our waveform so that we can move this noise around until eventually we get a new sound that has nearly the same activations at that convolutional layer as the original sound. Additionally, because this model is feed forward, the network will give the same prediction for this original sound and what we now call our model metamer. So a natural question once we generate these model metamers is, are these stimuli also metameric for humans? But a model may in fact develop some task-specific invariances that are human-like. For instance, an ideal result here might be stimuli that are distinct but recognized as the same word. For instance, model metamers that are different people saying the same thing. So instead, we evaluate whether the invariances are shared using a recognition test. This is the same task the model was trained on. And the logic is that minimally, metamers that are generated for a natural speech stimulus should be recognizable as words to humans. Humans should be able to do the task on the model metamers. And so we set up this recognition task for humans. In this case, the audio networks have been trained to do a word and noise task. So humans hear a sound, and they're just asked what word is in the middle of the clip. And they have to respond based on a set list of words, which is a couple hundred words. So people are able to do this really easily for natural speech signals. So for instance, this person would say, okay, I heard the word above. So then people will hear examples of model metamers generated from different layers of the network. And they'll have to do the same task. And if humans are not able to recognize the model metamer, then the model invariances do not match up with human perceptual invariances. However, if human responses are the same for the original sound and the model metamer, then invariances may be shared between the two systems. So just to tell you a little bit more about this model, this network is trained to identify the word in the middle of a 2-second sound clip, which is exactly the same task that we were having humans do. There's 800 different words for this model, approximately, and each of these words is embedded within a natural sound background. And one other thing to note here is that the input to this network is a cochleogram representation. So cochleograms have time on one axis and frequency on the other axis. Many of you might be familiar with a spectrogram representation. You can think of a cochleogram very similar to a spectrogram, except that it's essentially based on a crude approximation of the frequency decomposition that takes place within the human ear. So once we have these models, let's just take a sidestep and remind ourselves why exactly we think that this network is a compelling model for human perception. And the answer to that is that we've previously found that this network matches human behavior quite well. Specifically, we had the network do the word classification task on different types of background noise, as we varied the SNR between the foreground and the background of the sound. So here I'm plotting the human behavioral performance for this task, and you can see that humans have a particular set of behavioral patterns. And now I'm plotting the deep neural network performance on this word and noise task. And what you see is that the human results and the network results look really similar. The network is having a hard time at conditions where humans find hard, whereas it's able to easily do the conditions that humans find easy. And so some of this work might sound a bit familiar to some of you because in fact you've seen more detailed comparisons for a similar network, which were presented by a past CSGF fellow in 2018. So if I've convinced you that this is a plausible model of human perception, the rest of the talk, essentially, I'm going to ask the question of, as I said before, do our deep neural network models share invariances, even though these are the best models that we currently have today? So just as a quick demo, I will show you the model metamers generated for each of these model stages. So here I'm showing you cochleograms, and note that we are always going to be generating waveform metamers because this is an audio trained network. And so the cochleogram representations are just a visualization of the audio that has been generated as a model metamer for each layer. All of these are generated on clean speech, and so this is the original audio here. So as a reference, if this says the second convolutional layer, that means that the activations were matched at this convolutional layer for this sound back to the original audio. So we can just listen to some examples of these as we move through the network in order to hear the type of invariances that the network is learning.
It's a job security program that prevents layoffs. It's a job security program that prevents layoffs. It's a job security program that prevents layoffs.
So at these early stages of the network, you are still able to make out the words that are present in the clip. Now as we move further,
it's a job security program that prevents layoffs. It's a job security program that prevents layoffs.
So for these examples, you can still maybe hear that there's some sort of speech that's present, but it starts to become really hard to hear the words that are present in the middle of the clip. Now finally, we move to the late model stages. And at these final stages of the network, these model metamers don't sound like speech at all. So they're matched to this original clean speech sound, which we heard at the beginning, but at the end, the model metamers generated from the late model stages just sound really unrealistic, and there's no speech content present. Now, of course, that's just a demo, and so we actually did run the behavioral experiment where we had humans do this task. And what I'm plotting here is the proportion correct, and this first dotted line is the network performance on the model metamers. So just as a reminder, the network finds all of these model metamers to be as recognizable as the original sounds. So now what happens when I plot human performance? Well, as expected, you see that as we move deep into the network, humans are no longer able to do the task on these model metamers. So essentially, the invariances that are present within this model are not lining up with human perception. Now, we found a similar phenomenon for visual trained networks. Particularly, we took 3 example architectures which had all been trained to do the ImageNet classification task, which is a 1,000-way object categorization task that many of these networks were trained on. So what you see here is that at the late model stages, the metamers are not recognizable to humans. And this is very similar to the results that we found in the audio case. Obviously, we need to quantify this in some way. And so we used a task which was presented by the Bethke lab back in 2018. And this puts ImageNet into 16 different object categories, which are human which humans are able to categorize easily. So for instance, in this case, an image of a bear would pop up on the screen, and you would respond by clicking the bear icon. So what happens for these networks? Once again, just to remind you, the network is able to easily recognize all of these model metamers. But once again, we see that human performance recognizing these model metamers drops off significantly for late stages of the network. Okay, so as I wrap up, if you follow neural network literature, you possibly know that some of the methods that we are using here are not particularly new, because people have in fact tried to invert the model representations before. But we think that the link to perception has really been underappreciated, and that people using these models as models of neural activity don't often acknowledge that the invariances at deep layers of the network don't align with human invariances. And part of this is due to the use of natural image priors and other regularizations, which make the image look more natural. Although such regularization can generate visually appealing images, the importance of using a natural image prior suggests that there are differences between the network representations and those of humans. Now, another thing that this result may remind you of is adversarial examples. Adversarial examples are essentially the dual of model metamers. They are stimuli that are metameric for humans, but that are different for the network. Whereas model metamers, as we are presenting them here, are stimuli that are the same for the network, and in fact, they happen to be different for humans. So to summarize what we've talked about today, deep convolutional neural network models remain the best models of human perception. They are able to predict human behavior for natural signals very well. But our results here using model metamers indicate that there is some important work yet to be done if we want to develop complete models of perception. With this in mind, we are now evaluating changes in model architecture and training, and we're finding that certain types of modification yield models that perform better on our metamer test. One example of this is with the collaboration with Alexander Madre's group at MIT. Here we are evaluating networks that are trained to be less susceptible to adversarial examples. As you can see on this slide, these networks have metamers that look more natural and also are evaluated to be more recognizable to human observers. This is a promising direction for candidate models of perceptual system. So to conclude, I would like to thank CSGF for providing me with funding for the past 4 years of my PhD. I have the flexibility to pursue computational projects has been really fun, and I have also met some really interesting people through the program. Additionally, I would like to thank my advisor, Josh McDermott, for all of the help on the work I presented today. And I would like to thank my collaborators for this project, Alex Durango and Ray Gonzalez. And all of this was presented at NeurIPS last year. Finally, I would like to thank my other funding sources and the rest of the lab for computational